All right. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you today. I am going to start today's... Oh, I probably need that, don't I? Yeah, thank you. I forget some things. Anyway, I'm going to start today's class with a question. And so this is for everybody out here. What do you think is the most significant development from the industrial revolutions, first and second? What's the most significant development from that? Anybody? Yes?
Transportation of food.
Okay, transportation of food. Anybody else?
Steam engine. Steam engine.
Steam engine? Well, I think the most significant development actually was population growth. If we look at this chart, you will see a significant change in the population of the planet. For example, up from prehistory, roughly 10,000 BC, until the 17th or 18th century, 1700, the population of the planet grew by approximately 0.1%. With the Industrial Revolution, indeed, we begin to see a significant increase. Now, yes, indeed, it is increasing a little bit. So if we look here at the time of Christ, we see that the total population of the planet is estimated at 190 million people. We see here in the 14th century with the Black Death that indeed we begin to see a little decrease of 200 million. So by 1750, roughly, the population of the planet is estimated to be 700 million. With the Industrial Revolution, and of course people like Fritz Haber, who we talked about, creating all that nice nitrogen fertilizer, indeed the population starts to grow immensely. So by 1900, the population is now 1.65 billion people. It takes a slight, doesn't decrease, but it slows between World War I and World War II, and then slows again during World War II. But indeed, the population of the planet is skyrocketing. So, in the 250 years of the Industrial Revolution, the planet's population goes from 700 million to 7.7 billion people. An incredible, incredible rapidly growth. Only 250 years. So, that is, I think, the biggest change in the Industrial Revolution to the world, is the increase in humanity. Well, what does that lead for this class is indeed that makes it more possible to have giant armies because you've got all these people. So we now have the option to make armies much, much larger than they ever were before. And then, of course, with the Industrial Revolution, you now have the ability to arm these armies with modern weaponry. So there's huge, huge changes here in that 250-year period. Well, previously, I believe in the first class, I did not really talk about the gunpowder revolution because I thought I would save it for this particular discussion. Because the gunpowder revolution really makes a huge change, the possibility for, indeed, mass armies. So with the availability of gunpowder and gunpowder weapons, for example, we see the breakdown of castles. So castles no longer are very useful for defensive purposes because of the cannonballs can knock the walls down and you can invade the castle. The other piece is, of course, is that the guns that are going to be used is the arquebus. Now the arquebus is a very simple gun. It is closely related to the flintlock, only instead of using a flint to fire it, you actually have a match and you touch the match to the touch hole to get this gun to fire. So it doesn't work particularly well in rainy weather. It is also a time when armor is becoming obsolete. So the mounted knights that we think of with the big giant lance in their hands and the giant suit of armor, those people are beginning to become less important, or as I like to refer to it as heavy cavalry. They are becoming less important as well. Now, we could say, well, weren't they less important because of the longbow? Yes, they were. Though good quality plate armor, as I sent you that video, indeed could defeat the armor plate if it was made properly, the best stuff. Also, we had the Swiss pike or the halberd. The halberd is also capable of dismounting infantry, or dismounting cavalry by infantry, by yanking them off their horses, basically. But both of those things require a significant amount of training. For example, a longbowman needs to be incredibly strong to pull that longbow back, and you need to start to learn to do that as a child. So that's the first piece. The second piece, if you're going to use the halberd effectively, you need to use that halberd in a group. And again, you need to be pretty strong, pretty physically fit in order to properly use this thing. So the fact that you need so much training and stuff to make these weapons effective creates a situation where it's very difficult to make a mass army. Well, of course, the training is an issue too, and the fact that you have to be able to function with these things. And it leads to basically the armies are created in two ways at this time period. Either they are a nobility class that basically is an army, is trains to be an army all the time, or they use mercenaries, which would be professional soldiers, again, to be a professional army. Well, if you look at armor plate, and I think this is a pretty interesting picture, really, you can see that the Frenchman that was wearing this armor plate at the Battle of Waterloo had a very bad day. They do not stop cannonballs. But armor plate originally was pretty good about stopping the weapons of the arquebus, for example. It was fairly, as we saw in the video, it was pretty effective against stopping the longbow if it was properly made. And as time goes on, though, with the development of the flintlock and mass firepower by people in ranks, you see that the armor is becoming less and less effective. Plus, these things have a higher muzzle velocity. They fire a larger, more potent round, and they can penetrate armor at up to 100 meters. Now, the question is, can you hit anything at 100 meters with those guns? Probably not. But if you fire in a big group, you might hit something. So even though they have limited accuracy, it begins to make these people in armor less and less effective. And if you continue to make the armor heavier and denser and thicker in order to stop these weapons, then indeed it becomes so heavy and unwieldy you can't actually function. So again, armor is beginning to rapidly go away because of gunpowder. Well, another way to make a mass army is to train your recruits. Well, if you can train your recruits quickly, that's going to help you. And right now, with gunpowder, now you can train somebody in a matter of weeks to fire that gun in a pretty effective manner. Now, marksmanship is not important because the guns themselves are so incredibly inaccurate that you don't have to worry much about being a marksman. What you do have to train people to do, though, is simply to stay in line, to follow orders, to make sure that they get up at one time, aim that gun at one time, fire on command, then get back down, reload, and then the line behind them, sometimes two, sometimes as many as 4 lines behind them, will then fire over their heads while they're reloading. And that way you can have a more continuous amount of firepower going out. And that's what they're trained to do. They're also trained to not break ranks. Because if they break ranks, indeed, then of course that reduces firepower. So they are told, regardless of the people dying next to you, you stay in that line and you continue to fire. This is particularly necessary against cavalry. Well, what happens then is with this firepower that these lines can do with flintlocks, which can now penetrate armor at about 100 meters, is indeed it takes away heavy cavalry completely. They no longer will be any knights in armor running around with lances because they just are completely ineffective. Well, if we look at that, so if you can get a peasant and you can train him in a couple of weeks to fire a gun and follow simple orders, indeed you can see a breakdown of the society that was prevalent at that time, particularly feudalism. Feudalism will now become extinct in effect because people can't, you don't need knights in armor anymore. You don't need these people because you now have mass armies of people armed with guns. So armor starts to definitely go away at this period. And if we look at the Satsuma Rebellion, this is the latest example I can give you of an end of feudalism, is in 1877, the Japanese samurai, who have now been basically displaced, they no longer have their position in Japan as being feudal fighters. So basically, Emperor Meiji has taken away feudalism. These samurais are not happy about this. They are very unhappy. And they decide under Seigo Takamori to have a rebellion against the Japanese government. Well, the Japanese government under Emperor Meiji has said, quote, that indeed every man is a samurai, and they have begun to build an army of common people armed with weapons. This army is larger than Takamori's samurai army, and they easily defeated, I believe, in about 7 months. They destroy the revolution. And what this shows us is even though these people have spent their lifetime learning how to use a samurai sword and are very, very trained and very disciplined people, they are easily defeated by a mass army armed with guns. And again, feudalism in Japan is over. Well, we look at J.F.C. Fuller, a famous British historian after World War I. And he famously states that the musket made the infantryman and the infantryman made the Democrat. And so basically, militaries now are not going to be armies of aristocrats, but indeed are going to be armies of common men. Now, during the Middle Ages, of course, when the peasants would revolt, it was very easy to put these people down and get them back into place because the nobility had the firepower or the wherewithal or the techniques to defeat these peasants. Well, if you start having armed peasants, now you've got a problem if you're an aristocracy. And I think it's surprising almost that the aristocracies of Europe lasted as long as they did in the face of gunpowder weapons. Well, one of the reasons they did last that long is the fact that they refused to provide armaments to the common people as much as possible. So they would limit your ability to own a gun. They would also do things like the fact that the guns were expensive. It's very expensive to make a gun at this time. They're hand-built. Gunpowder is hard to come by. It is not mass-produced. As we talked about in the naval battles, the fact that the British, even up to the time of Waterloo and fighting the French, limited the amount of gunpowder that was allowed to be used on their ships because, again, gunpowder is expensive and hard to come by. So the fact that these people, the common people, are not able to get their hands on guns, and even if they do, they're certainly not trained well on them, really limits, I think, how much we could see European countries having revolts earlier than, say, the French Revolution. Now, of course, we look at the American Revolution, where an armed militia defeats the British Army and, of course, their Hessian mercenaries. Of course, they do that with a significant amount of help from the French. So the French army is here, the French Navy is helping us, and indeed we are able to overcome Britain at that time. And our Second Amendment basically talks about an armed militia. But with modern weapons, and particularly the weapons of the Second Industrial Revolution, that theory of an armed militia is pretty much a thing of the past. For example, if we look at the French resistance in World War II, frequently the Allies would tell the French resistance people, please don't attack Germans because you're just going to get your butt kicked. Don't do that. You're much more valuable to us by not attacking the Germans and reporting back to us and telling us what's going on. So they would and there's an example in southeastern France, there's like a plateau, and the French resistance basically started really getting aggressive. And the Germans sent in a third-rate division. I mean, not a good division at all. They didn't have like a lot of tanks or anything, right? And that third-rate division sends these French resistance people just scattering because they don't have anything but really rifles and submachine guns provided by the British. But this third-rate division has mortars and artillery. And so the resistance fighters in France can't stand up to this firepower. Well, that brings to mind a famous movie. Now, maybe you've seen a movie called Red Dawn. We all seen Red Dawn? Okay, Red Dawn. All right. High school students armed with captured AK-47s fight Cuban invaders of the United States. All right? Well, sorry to say, gang, but no. It makes for a really nice story, but the fact of the matter is these high school students wouldn't survive very long at all. So really, again, it's a nice, maybe they should have, the two main stars should have stuck to Dirty Dancing. That would have probably been a better outlet for them. But anyway, the fact of the matter is these people don't, things just have changed too much, all right? So look, take this to yourself, okay? I'm in my house and I've decided that I don't like the government, and an M1 Abrams tank rolls up on my driveway, and I've got my AR-15 and I'm going to defend my house from this M1A1 Abrams, right? I might as well be throwing beanbags at it. So the days of trained militia are long over. So keep that in mind when people talk about these kind of things like Red Dawn. It's fantasy. Well, that leads us to conscription. And indeed, conscription is a huge change. And conscription starts about really with and it's really the antithesis of what goes on in America with the armed militia piece. This is going to be to create an army by the draft. And it's created by the French in 1793. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to defend the French Revolution from counter-revolution from the aristocratic states that surround them. Because the aristocratic states do not want the French Revolution going on. They are very, very unhappy about this. The big winner of this conscription, of course, is going to be Napoleon, because Napoleon is going to have the access to this very, very large indigenous French army. Well, how does this come about? So in 1793, in February, the French are very, very afraid that they're going to be overwhelmed by the counter-revolution. And they begin to conscript 300,000 men. Later in August of that year, they make it national conscription. Well, everyone, because of the emergency, is going to be, it's of military age, is going to become part of the French military. Well, then in 1798, they put this Jourdan law, and that basically makes conscription mandatory and puts it in position for the entire state. So now it's not just because of an emergency, it's going to be, this is going to be policy. And the Jourdan law, if you're 20 to 25, you're eligible for military service. You will have the option to get out of military service for several reasons. For example, you could be part of the clergy. You could be in a certain university. You could have a skill that's needed to create armaments for the army. And of course, if you're a politician, you need not serve. But you also have the option of buying a replacement. So I've got some cash and I really don't want to be in the Army. So what I will do is I will pay someone to take my place. And this is acceptable. We also see this same policy during the American Civil War with people buying replacements so they don't have to serve in the military. What of course that does is that makes the military very much a part of the poor and the lower classes of the country. Well, let's talk about the law. First principle. Doesn't this sound like Emperor Meiji? Every Frenchman is a soldier and must defend the country. But the key part here is the second one. Outside of the case of danger to the country, the Army is formed from voluntary enrollment and by way of military conscription. So what they are saying there is from now on, the Army will always be based on conscription. It won't be just during an emergency. So conscription now becomes national policy even when in times of peace. So indeed, they can create a large army very quickly. Well, we see now that for the first time, massive amounts of the population can be used in the military. And really, this becomes a paradigm of modern warfare. Indeed, mass giant armies will become, will lead really to total war. So the French have a population of 30 million. They are able to get enough people through the draft, for example, in 1 year for the invasion of Russia, which they can create a 400,000 man army just for that invasion. That's not their whole army. They have 285,000 allies and they attack Russia. They fail miserably, but they do attack Russia. But between 1800 and 1813, they conscript 2.6 million Frenchmen. Now that's out of a population of 30 million. Well, of a population of 30 million, of course, half of that population are female. A lot of that population are too young to fight. A lot of that population are too old to fight. So for them to be able to create that size of an army out of that population base is pretty incredible, and they will do even much better come World War I. Well, the Prussians see this going on, and after their defeat by Napoleon at the Battle of Jena, they say, hey, you know what? We got to jump on this conscription bandwagon because this is working out really well. And under Scharnhorst, who is pictured here, Gneisenau, and other young Prussian officers, they decide that they're going to have conscription. Well, Prussia does it a little different. If you're between 17 and 24, you can volunteer and be in a regiment of your choice. If you decide not to do that, indeed, you will be drafted. Then they changed the law further in September of 1814, and all men 20 years of age will be compelled to serve for 3 years. And here's the key. After that 3 years of service, you will be compelled to be in a reserve. So you can be called up at a moment's notice to fill out the army with more men. And this reserve aspect of the German methodology of drafting makes for a huge change. It makes it so you can have a giant army really quickly. And we'll see that in World War I. Well, the Russians, they've got a little problem. They still have serfdom until 1861, so they really don't need to draft people because they're all serfs anyway. But they, in 1874, begin to have their version of conscription, and their version is a little different in that in Russia, everybody 20 years of age that is suitable to be in the army will serve for 6 years. So that's a very long time. Well, you can see in the picture that at this point they are basically conscripting Poles. And if you look at the picture, those Poles don't look particularly happy to be being conscripted. But they don't have much choice as they are surrounded by Russian cavalry. So welcome to the Tsar's army. Well, by 1914, there are only 2 countries, major military powers, that do not have conscription. and that is Great Britain and the United States. But everybody else has adopted conscription, and it's very, very similar to, by this time, to the Prussian model. Well, we look at population. So by 1800 to 1900, let's look at the population growth of countries. France, surprisingly, doesn't have a significant growth in population. I have no idea why their birth rate is so low, considering they're relatively industrialized. And they only grow their population by 10 million, but of course they have colonies, so they really have a pool of 80 million people that they could potentially draw on. The British population of whites is 16 million at 1800. By 1900, it is a population of 49 million whites. If we look at their population with, for example, India included, their population goes up to 345 million people. Australia, in 1800, only has a population of 5,200. By 1900, it has a population of 3.5 million, primarily due to immigration. But those people now are all available to be part of the British military, as Australia does join Britain as a partner in World War I. They don't really have to, but they do. Russia's population, again through expansion primarily, not just birth rate growth, but they become very much larger, from 35 million to 119 million. That is primarily, well, not primarily, but a good portion of that is from the fact that they have expanded into areas like Georgia. So they've gained a lot of population. Prussia, 10.7 million, but with German unification and a very high birth rate, they have by 1900 a population of almost 60 million. So they greatly outnumber the French. The French are very concerned by this. Austria-Hungary, 23 million to 47 million. And the sick man of Europe, who has the least amount of industrialization, is the Ottoman Empire. And of course, they have the smallest amount of growth, from 26 million to only 32 million in that 100-year time frame. So we can see that the countries generally that have been most industrialized are indeed the countries that have huge population growth, France being pretty much an exception. Well, the French realized this. In 1870, they organized their conscription on a class basis. So in other words, if it's this year would be the class of 19, for example, like school. But they did come up with this idea where they're going to draft people, pretty much everybody they can get their hands on, and at 20 to 21 years of age, you will serve for 2 years in the military, and then you will go into the reserves, and for a very, very long time. The active army, 20 to 23, then the reserve of the active army, where you get training every year, that will be from 24 to 34 years of age. Then the territorial army, for 35 to 41, you don't get training every year, but you're still expected to be called up if there's a mobilization. And then there's the reserve of the territorial army from 42 to 48. So realistically, you will be responsible for service in the French army for 28 years. That is a long time. So then France, realizing they're still way behind the curve against Germany as far as population and ability to have a large military, then they put in a 3-year law. So instead of being in the active army for only 2 years, now you're in the active army for 3 years. And it just gets heavy, really. And then they even go so far as to begin to limitedly draft Muslims in Algeria. I know of no other really imperial power of this time that went to that level of trying to get conscription in order. So you can see the French are very, very concerned about conscription and being underpowered by the military of the Germans. Well, so in August of 1914, when they mobilized, they have 2.9 million Frenchmen mobilized. So they've got the 3 years, they've got all these guys, and they start to take so many casualties in World War I early on that they weren't expecting these older territorials to be in the front line. They really weren't expecting 40, 48-year-old people that haven't been trained at all in years to be frontline soldiers. Well, they are forced because of losses to begin to use those people in the front lines. So it is a huge amount of manpower that they put in there. Well, here are the numbers for the beginning of World War I. We'll start with the Entente powers, which would be France, Russia, and Great Britain. And those are in the little darker color. So France mobilizes on early in World War I, 4,017,000. The Russians, nearly 6 million men are mobilized, and Great Britain, because they have a professional army and no draft, have an army of 975,000. So basically they've got 11 million men on these three countries. The Central powers, primarily Germany and Austria, Germany can mobilize 4,500,000, and Austria-Hungary can mobilize 3 million people. So you have 7.5 million versus 11 million. Big, big armies compared to the past. And again, that is primarily due to the fact of reserves. Well, that brings us to mobilization. And mobilization is now definitely something that is a creation of the Second Industrial Revolution. So I've got all these reserves. They're scattered all over the country. I need to get them to a place where they can be put into the army, where they can get their weapons, they can get their uniforms, and then be moved to the front. I use the telegraph to do that. So now I send out telegrams to all these people that are in the reserves and say, you need to report on this day to this train station and get on this train. And that train is going to take you to a depot. At that depot you will be armed, and once you're armed at that depot you will then be transported to the front and be sent in to fight. So you have three pieces that are all working together because of the Industrial Revolution. You have the telegraph, you have railways, and you have conscription. And that all makes mobilization possible. So the mobilization of mass armies was a highly developed plan. You need to have a very good plan in place to move millions of people all over the country. And the fact is that to mobilize was viewed as an act of war. So on July 30th of 1914, the Tsar of Russia orders mobilization. And when he orders mobilization, he hasn't declared war on anybody. He hasn't declared war on Germany or Austria. The Germans immediately, out of fear, declare war on Russia. And of course, the thing begins to snowball from that point. Well, the story goes that when this started, the Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany says, hey, wait a minute. We got to stop this. We don't really want to go to war. This is crazy. Because who's he going to war with? Well, the Tsar of Russia is his first cousin. The King of England is his first cousin. They're all related through Queen Victoria. So these people are they all know each other. They're all relatives. Okay? Now, they don't necessarily have a great opinion of each other, but the fact of the matter is they are all related. And he says, look, we got to stop this. This is crazy. And his generals tell him, we can't stop it. If we stop this, they could mobilize and they could have an army at our door before we're ready, and we could lose the war right away. And indeed, they don't stop it. Well, another piece of mobilization is the fact that these people have got all these people to move. And of course, these things are based on absolutely the worst case scenarios. So that everything is going to go great with Russian mobilization, or everything's going to go great with German mobilization, and we have to mobilize as quick and perfectly as we can in order to prevent losing the war, because we can lose the war in basically days, because people can move so fast. So there's no room for error in these plans. But some people think about this as almost like a holiday. A lot of these soldiers are basically think this is a great thing. Hey, we're going to go to war, yay, okay. So The Germans have mobilized 11,000 trains to move their people. The French have mobilized 7,000 trains to move their people. They have even begun to draft millions of horses. So horses are drafted into the army. And again, you see this thing just starts to just take over, you can't stop this train, basically. But people are happy about this. And we see this picture, and this is a famous picture, and I'm not going to go into great detail, but so the crowds in Bavaria are welcoming World War I. This is great, okay? And the guy that took this picture actually turns out to be the photographer that becomes friends with Hitler and becomes Hitler's main photographer. And Hitler one day supposedly tells this photographer, yeah, I was at this rally in Bavaria. And the photographer goes, you know what, I was at that rally too, and I was taking pictures. So he begins, the story goes, to search for young Hitler in this picture, and indeed, purportedly, he finds him, and there is young Hitler being happy to be part of World War I. Now, why is Hitler in Bavaria to join the army? He's an Austrian. Well, he doesn't want to be in the Austrian army because the Austrian army is full of Jews and Slavs. And he doesn't want to serve with Jews and Slavs. He wants to serve with Germans. So he moves to Bavaria, petitions the king of Bavaria to be part of the German army, and indeed the king of Bavaria, needless to say, grants him his wish. Why wouldn't you? And okay, Hitler's in the Bavarian army even though he's an Austrian. Well, that's one more piece of mobilization that's really critical. If the soldiers are at the front, what we will call being back home would be called the home front, particularly in World War II. So we now have to change our factories and everything from making consumer goods to making military goods. And indeed, that's what they do. And weapons at this time have become incredibly complicated. For example, a battleship has millions of parts created by thousands of workers. Well, if these workers are at the front, who's going to take their jobs? Women. So women will be very critical at the home front. And the functions of this thing, the combination of the home front making all these weapons for all these men that are at the front will cause us to have a thing called total war. Because what we need to do now is we need to stop the production. So how do we stop the production? One way is to use blockade or submarines to prevent raw materials from coming in. Another way is to destroy the factories themselves, or perhaps to incapacitate the workforce. Destroying the factories themselves actually is more of a function of World War II with air power, but as we will see later in these classes, that you can incapacitate the workforces in other ways besides dropping bombs on them, or as the British like to euphemistically refer to it as dehousing. Of course, hopefully you weren't home when you were dehoused, but another story. So, production begins to increase greatly when they start changing over. So, for example, in Russia, the production of shells by late 1915 has gone up 2,000%. So now in a month, they're making 1.5 million shells in Russia, which is a huge accomplishment for them. They're not as industrialized as other nations. We also see, though, in France, with women taking over, that by this time the French are able to make 100,000 artillery shells every single day. So, you see this giant factory? They are making shells like there's no tomorrow. Part of this problem is, though, is because of their making so many shells so rapidly and with using people that don't really make shells on a regular basis, a lot of these artillery shells are very defective, which will be a problem. The other piece is they're buying shells from the United States, and again by manufacturers that don't really make shells, and a lot of those shells are defective as well. So, with that said, why don't we take a short break? Well, I am going to get started here. Hopefully everybody can hear me well. Okay, good. You know, I missed a part in that thing that I really thought would be interesting to mention. And when the French began to mobilize about how fun it was to go to war, and fortunately Judy brought this up and reminded me, that the way you did the mobilization is you would be, some people would go to the train station on day 1, some people would go on to day 2, and so on. I think it was like 9 or 14 days total. And the people that had day 1 were giving basically a bunch of bull to the people that were, say, on day 5, going that, you know, well, by the time you get mobilized, we'll be halfway to Berlin. And then the guys on day 5 talking to the guys on day 9 saying basically, well, I don't even know why you're bothering to be mobilized, because by the time you get mobilized, the war will be over. And needless to say, it didn't quite work that way. But that's really what they thought. So let us look now at the battle plans of the major antagonists in the West. The German plan is based on what they believe would be a two-front war. There would be an eastern front against Russia, there would be a western front against France, and of course Britain. But they hope really to win the war before Britain could really mobilize fully. And the fact of the matter is this plan of the Germans was known as, they didn't call it this, but we always call it the Schlieffen Plan. And Schlieffen was the head of the German General Staff before World War I, and had developed this plan. And the idea of the plan was simply that they would leave a token force in the east to face the Russians, because the Russian mobilization would be so slow that they could then transfer the vast majority of their forces, crush France in 6 weeks, and then transfer the forces back to fight the Russians before the Russians would be able to muster an assault. And the presumption of this came from the poor performance of the Russians in the War of 1905 with the Japanese. So that's why the Germans thought they could pull this off. The fact is, they were going to try to go through Belgium. They were going to ask the Belgians to just let them walk through. Hey, we don't want to attack you. We like Belgium. It's a nice place. We like your chocolate. And the Belgians, of course, refuse. They're like, no, you may not march your army through us to attack France. Schlieffen also wanted to attack Holland, or actually not attack Holland, but to basically say the same deal to Holland. Hey, just let us move our troops through, and we won't fight with you, and everything will be cool, and we'll beat the French, and then everything will go back to normal. I'm sure it would. But the Belgians say, no, we're not doing this. We're not going to be your patsy on this deal. And they invoke a treaty from 1839 with England. Of course, with the German violation of Belgian territory and the Belgians resisting, that forces England to declare war on Germany on August 4th. But you can see here, it's like a big wheel going through Belgium, along the Channel, the English Channel coast, and then sweeping south of Paris to crush the French army basically from behind. So again, and I really like this piece. Moltke is the head of the German General Staff, and he is known as the Younger. His uncle was in charge of the German army during the War of 1866 with Austria, big Prussian victory, and of course defeats France in 1870, another big Prussian victory, and causes the unification of Germany. But Moltke the Younger is a little bit of a different stripe than his illustrious uncle. And he says, you know what, this isn't a good idea. We need to leave Holland alone, because there's a chance that the British will blockade us, and we will need to get natural resources and supplies from Holland, being a neutral country. We can trade with them. Well, that kind of puts a monkey wrench in their plans, because they now have to move 600,000 men through a road network, through a gap in Belgium that's only 12 miles wide. And so this makes the logistics problems with the German army gigantic. So this is going to slow them down significantly. The other piece, of course, is that the Belgians are not going to just let them march through. Well, the French plan is very, it's almost the same in a sense. Their plan is called Plan 17. They've been developing these plans since 1880. And Plan 17 departs from their normal planning. Their normal plan, for example, Plan 16, was to let the Germans attack, dig in, build up a large reserve army. After the Germans have expended their force attacking the French fixed positions, then the reserve army will come out and crush the Germans. Joffre, on the other hand, who is now the head of the French army, says, you know what, our troops are damn good. They're tough, they know how to fight, they are motivated. And by the way, we've got really good artillery. So what we're going to do is we're going to do something completely different. We're going to attack the Germans first, and we're going to retake Alsace-Lorraine, which of course they lost in 1870 to the Prussians. And then we're going to cut the Germans off, because we bet those Germans are going to go through Belgium anyway. So we're going to fool them. We're going to attack them. And indeed, he really believes this, that their gun power of the French 75s and the elan of their troops can overwhelm German firepower. So, I really like this picture. Does anybody realize what these people are doing? They are shooting an airplane. This is World War I's idea of anti-aircraft fire. I like some of these people aren't even aiming. But interesting to me that the Japanese in World War II actually fit anti-aircraft sights onto their military rifles and try to duplicate this same idea. But I just thought it was kind of a fun picture. So anyway, the plans for both sides, the Germans and the French, are terribly flawed. The Germans do not have the logistics capability to achieve their goals. The French certainly do not have the elan and firepower to achieve their goals, because the weapons have now gotten so much more potent. And at this point, I'm going to depart from my usual methodology, and I'm going to read something to you from the very famous John Keegan, who I've recommended early on to you all in my syllabus. And Keegan says, the armies that marched to war in 1914 could produce volumes of firepower inconceivable even by the expectations of moderns like Grant and Sherman. Cannon, apportioned in Napoleon's army in a ratio of 3 to 1,000 men, not only had doubled in proportion, but fired 20 times faster. The infantryman's personal weapon fired 8 times faster to a range 10 times as great. And in supplement, each infantry battalion deployed 2 machine guns that duplicated the fire of 80 of its riflemen put together. A brigade of infantry, 3,000 men, when supported by its third of the divisional artillery, could in consequence discharge each minute a volume of fire at least equal to that of the whole of Wellington's army of 60,000 strong, firing volley and salvo at Waterloo. So every minute, 3,000 men can fire the firepower of 60,000 only 100 years later. And of course, today they have much greater than that. So the killing zone now is also huge, considering how compact these masses are of people running out in the open with no armor. You're wearing a shirt, and you're going to be facing this kind of firepower. So it's basically a disaster. And how does that disaster look like? It looks like the very famous Battle of the Frontiers. So if we see this picture, we can see that the French are going to launch their first attacks here in Alsace-Lorraine, and then are going to attack here in the Ardennes. Well, the French do launch their attacks, and they gain some ground. But then the Germans counterattack. Again, everybody's out in the open here. They're taking gigantic casualties. And the French are actually driven back to their starting position. So they've gained no ground against the Germans. The French Fifth Army attacks in the Ardennes. That's here. They have poor reconnaissance. They don't have enough artillery. They go against fixed German positions, and they indeed are slaughtered. So infantry against mass firepower is automatically at this point, as we've seen with John Keegan, is doomed to defeat. Well, let's look at the French uniforms. Now here's a good idea. Let's have some camouflage. The Germans have switched to what they call field gray. The French have kept this uniform of a nice blue coat and nice red pants. And Erwin Rommel, who is a young officer at this time, notes that he can see the French troops coming from a long way away because they're all wearing copper cooking pots on their backs that are shining in the sun. I mean, really, does it say shoot me or what? I mean, But anyway, that was the French uniform. So the French probably should have followed Plan 16 instead of Plan 17. They would have been much better off with using their firepower from fixed positions to stop the Germans and then launching a counterattack than certainly they were by rushing headlong into German fire in Alsace-Lorraine and, of course, in the Ardennes. So they take unacceptable casualties, of course. The Germans take very light casualties until they try to regain ground. When they try to regain ground, of course, then they take heavy casualties. What does this show us? That it is impossible at this time to face massed firepower. Well, what's going on with the Germans? Well, they wanted to go into Belgium. They asked the Belgians, hey, could we just kind of get through here? No problem. And the Belgians say no, of course. And that causes the Battle of Liege. And Liege is a very, very important road and rail junction leading from Germany into the interior of Belgium. Well, it's the first engagement on the German side. They attack the town, basically, but the town is pretty well defended. It has fortifications that were built in the 1880s. They're not great fortifications, but it's still fortified. And the Germans don't take Liege right away, of course, and this slows them down perhaps 4 or 5 days, which causes them a huge issue later on in the Battle of Mons. But first, so Liege is defended by these 12 forts. And these forts, they don't have particularly good concrete. They are armed with very obsolete black powder cannon. They don't have modern cannon with recoil systems and smokeless powder. But they can still fire a reasonable range and can control this road network. Well, the Germans, of course, asked them to surrender. The commander of Liege forts goes, you must fight your way through. The Germans then immediately launch an attack on the city of Liege. And what happens then is even though Liege isn't really properly defended, it doesn't have a big trench line between the forts, they still can't capture these forts. They don't have the firepower to do it, and of course the Germans are repulsed. Well, the Germans now are forced to resort to what's known as siege warfare, and they have actually thought this out relatively well. And what they have done is they have created giant cannon in order to break fortifications, because they know the Belgians have forts, they know the French have forts, particularly at Verdun, and they build this thing, the 420 millimeter Big Bertha. The Skoda Armaments work in Austria-Hungary, which is actually in Pilsen, Czech Republic today. They make cars, by the way, mostly. They created a 305 millimeter siege gun as well. Now, this thing, for a land gun, fires a shell larger than any gun that's carried on a battleship. It doesn't fire nearly as far, but it does fire a larger shell. So it's a pretty amazing piece of technology for 1914. As you can see in this picture, that is a big gun. Well, the Krupp 17-inch gun fires a 2,560-pound shell to a range of 10,000 yards. Again, not a lot of range. It is 42 tons. It can be broken down into 5 separate wagon loads, and the wagon loads are pulled by custom-made gasoline-powered tractors, in effect. The problem with those is they can only go about 4.3 miles an hour under ideal circumstances. So they really can't move this stuff very fast. Well, the Germans finally bring these things up on the 12th. So basically that is roughly 7 days, 8 days after this battle has started. And they begin to shell the Belgian forts. And you can see here this picture of this gentleman here at the top. That is a big fort, and it's got a big hole in it. And they begin to attack this particular fort on the 15th. And on the 25th shell that they fire, they hit the magazine and this fort blows up. Now the commander of all the forts happens to be in this fort, and he is taken unconscious from the wreckage. And he makes sure that the Germans tell the world that he was unconscious. He did not surrender, but in fact, he was blown up. So, I mean, it's like, okay, whatever. But no, I didn't surrender. I was carried from the fort. Well, that brings us now to the famous Battle of Mons. And Mons is in what's a little slice that's left of Belgium. So the Germans have moved through, they've captured the forts, and they are now going to confront the British Expeditionary Force at this area, Mons, and there's a big canal there, which is they're using it as a defensive line. So again, Britain has a very small but professional army. And on August 23rd, the Germans begin to bombard these positions at Mons. They heavily outnumber the British at the point of attack, and the British managed to fight very, very well because, again, they're a professional army. And the Germans believe that they have come under fire from massive amounts of machine guns. Well, that's not what happened. What has happened is the Germans have become under fire from well-trained British infantry using the Lee-Enfield rifle. The Lee-Enfield rifle is probably, in my opinion, the best rifle of World War I. It has a 10-round magazine, it has a very slick bolt action, and it is an excellent weapon firing out to 1,000 yards. The British have another thing they do is they basically give rewards and medals and pay bonuses for marksmanship. And they provide these professional troops large amounts of ammunition to practice with in order to get these rewards. So the British Army actually fires very, very well. And indeed, they have the Germans believe that they're facing machine guns when in fact they're facing rifles. Well, the British are also in prepared positions. The area around Mons where they're fighting is full of large slag heaps. It's very industrialized. And they have learned from the Boer War that indeed you had better dig a trench because if you don't, you're going to be in trouble. So they have come to the conclusion that they're going to fight from a prepared position. They're not going to be fighting out in the open. And they're really well prepared for defensive war. Well, the British, after a couple of days, are forced to retreat because the French Fifth Army is being pushed back and they're going to be flanked. And this begins a bunch of rearguard actions that spread for 250 miles. So the Germans are pushing the French and the British back for 250 miles. Both armies are really falling back in pretty good condition. So if you look at the Battle of Mons, really both sides kind of achieve sort of what they wanted. The British do hold them up for a couple of days. They inflict heavy casualties on the Germans. They prevent them from outflanking the 5th French Army. And the Germans, though, of course, are now having this advance towards Paris, which is their whole plan, is to sweep and take Paris. So both sides are pretty happy with the results, but the Germans obviously not with the casualties. But regardless, they're moving along in the right direction. Well, if we look at this picture, up here, this big red circle, that is where the Battle of Mons takes place. If we look down here, that is Paris. If you see here, this is the furthest advance of the German army. So they have gotten extremely close to Paris. Well,
How far is that?
how far is that?
How far?
About 250 miles. But they get within about 40 miles of Paris. Closest they get. Okay, so anyway, what's going on here is that they're going to, the original plan was to go west of the city and sweep around it. Moltke, the younger, he decides that, you know what we're going to do? We're going to change that plan. We're going to now try to crush the French army between Paris and Verdun. And so now he orders the German Second Army under von Bülow to become what the Germans like to refer to as the Schwerpunkt. And the Schwerpunkt is the main point of attack. And he says to von Bülow, he goes, no, I want you to turn east. And he has Kluck, von Kluck's army, he says to them, he says, I want you guys to now become, instead of being the Schwerpunkt, which you are now going to be relegated to defending the Second Army's flank. Well, von Kluck doesn't like that. He thinks this is wrong, and you know what? I'm the army commander, and I'm going to do what I want to do. And he decides that he's going to continue to go southeast, hoping to catch the flank of the French Fifth Army. This is not a good idea. Well, as we see, the Great Retreat had not defeated the French army, really, or defeated the British army. It just forced them to retreat. So they're falling back, and as they fall back, they're getting closer and closer and closer to their supply dumps. They're getting more and more capability to get strength. The Germans, on the other hand, can only supply, because the railroads are knocked out of service, are supplying their troops with horses and wagons. And as they continue to march all this distance, they are getting further and further away from their supplies. So, what is happening now is that we've got a problem for the Germans, and we have an opportunity for the French. And Joffre, the French commander, says to himself, you know, I got all those troops that aren't doing much in the Ardennes. I think we're going to put them on the train, and we're going to move them to Paris. I'm going to create a new Sixth Army, and I'm going to use that Sixth Army to launch a massive counterattack into the Germans. Well, he also wants to use the British Expeditionary Force under, the man's name is, he's Field Marshal French, but he's actually, by French standards, he's not a field marshal. But sort of technically, because he's a field marshal and Joffre is just a general, he technically would sort of outrank Joffre, which the French can't understand how this little tiny army would have a field marshal anyway, but that's his title. Well, French, the field marshal, is under no responsibility to Joffre whatsoever. He doesn't have to take any orders from him. And Joffre wants to launch this counterattack. French says, you know what? I don't want to have a counterattack right now. Our guys are tired. I think we need to take them out of the line for a couple of weeks and let them rest. And then after a couple of weeks, maybe we can consider having a counterattack. Well, Joffre is like losing it at this point. He's like, what? And he goes to the British government and says, look, dudes, can you get your guy under control here? We need to launch a counterattack. This could be the victory of the war right here. And the British government basically goes, we'll see what we can do. Joffre goes to the French's headquarters and has a meeting with French and basically shames the British Army into launching this counterattack. And indeed, French finally agrees that he will assist the French in the counterattack at the famous Battle of the Marne, or the First Battle of the Marne. Well, they begin to launch this counterattack with the the newly created French Sixth Army. The BEF is they're supposed to go kind of like northwest. The British BEF is supposed to go straight ahead, straight north, and the French Fifth Army on their flank is to go straight north and to try to catch the flank of the German Second Army. I know this gets a little confusing, but try to stay with me. So anyway, Kluck basically says, he sees the Sixth Army coming. He goes, aha, I can crush this Sixth Army, the new Sixth Army. And he swings his forces almost due west. When he swings his forces almost due west, this creates a 30-mile gap between the German First Army and the German Second Army. Allied air reconnaissance sees this big hole and goes, that looks like a really good place to launch an attack. And indeed, they promptly launched this attack with the French Fifth Army going into this massive hole and the BEF going into this massive hole. But this causes another major issue between the BEF and the French, in that the French feel very strongly that the BEF did not take advantage of this. They had a huge opportunity to blow a hole in the German line, and they only advance 40 kilometers in 3 days, even though they outnumber the Germans 10-1. So once again, this causes major friction between those two countries early in the war. That brings us to the famous, everybody knows about this one, the famous taxi cabs of the Marne. So the German Sixth Army is trying to crush the French Sixth Army. Von Kluck, the First Army guy, he's trying to crush them. And the French are going to reinforce the Sixth Army with 10,000 troops. And how are they going to do that? Well, General Gallieni is going to put those troops that are in Paris, and he's going to put them on 600 taxi cabs. He's going to drive them up to the front, and they are going to reinforce the Sixth Army to hold off von Kluck. And this is going to stop von Kluck from crushing the Sixth Army. Indeed, this is how it goes. But interestingly, the French taxi cab drivers are very dutiful, and as instructed by the city, they keep their meters running, and their meters are running, and they are charging the French government in order to get to the Marne. And the French government, after the battle, does in fact pay the French taxi cabs 70,012 francs, every penny. So indeed, that little cab becomes the first time that large-scale motorized infantry goes into battle. Yes, this is a far cry from half-tracks in World War II or the Bradley fighting vehicles that we use today, but these little cabs actually carried troops to battle and are the first use of motorized infantry, only possible in, of course, the Second Industrial Revolution. All right, so here we go. Here is Paris, obviously, and the attack here is the furthest line. You can see the hash red line, that is the furthest German advance. And of course, this is going to be the German retreat. And why does this happen? Well, Moltke, the younger, once again doesn't really know what's going on. So he sends Oberstlieutenant Hensch to see what is going on with this battle, because he's basically out of touch with both these armies. And I think it's interesting, only in the German army would you have a colonel have this kind of capability, because Hensch goes and sees the von Bülow of the Second Army and sees that there's this 30-mile gap in the French Fifth Army and the BEF are coming into it, and he says, dudes, we got to retreat like right now, because you're going to get outflanked and they're going to crush our entire Second Army here. And indeed, von Bülow says, you know what? You're right, we're going to retreat. Well, Hensch then goes to von Kluck's army, and he talks to von Kluck's chief of staff, and he says, you got to retreat. And the chief of staff's like, well, maybe. And then they get von Kluck involved, and von Kluck and the chief of staff say, no, we don't want to retreat. We're still going to crush that French Sixth Army. We can do it. And Hensch points out, well, you know, the Second Army is retreating. Your flank is now wide open. And if you don't retreat really fast, you're going to be doomed. And indeed, von Kluck then says, all right, we will retreat. Now, think this through. A colonel has just ordered an army commander to change his battle plan completely. Again, only something I think that would have been possible in the German army at that time. So the Germans are going to retreat back to that position, 40 miles back, and that is the end of the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan is now dead. They can no longer achieve anything that they wanted to do with that plan. They now have to come up with a different one. And I think that this line here is primarily where the rest of the land battles in the World War I are fought, because this becomes basically a trench line. And this line moves a little bit periodically, but very, very little, surprisingly. So basically, this line will be the line of battle for the next several years. Well, this begins the race to the sea. So now what's going to happen is each army group is looking for an open flank so they can get around the other army and get through and surround them and crush them. So again, this is still open warfare. And indeed, they continue from September 17th to October 19th, fighting their way, battle after battle, all the way up to basically the North Sea and the English Channel. The Belgians here have abandoned Antwerp and begin to form a line there. They are under extreme pressure by the Germans. And what happens at that point is they have the decision to open the floodgates and flood a significant portion of Belgium so the Germans can no longer advance. This stalls the German army significantly. So what we've seen then is that both sides continue to move north. Neither side can gain an advantage because you're out in the open getting shot. And they get all the way to the sea, basically, and stalemate is achieved. So World War I, as we know it, is now going to begin. So neither side can get a decisive advantage because of the firepower. And of course, now World War I looks like how we expect it to look today. If you look at this picture, you see one guy on duty, and actually I see 4, perhaps 5 people sleeping in the trench alongside him. So there's one there, there. So one guy's on duty, the rest of the people are taking a siesta. There might be another guy sleeping up there too. So this is what the war is going to look like. It's going to look like, for years, trenches, muddy, filthy, rat-infested trenches, artillery fire landing on you, machine guns mowing you down when you come out of these trenches. Indeed, it's going to be a hellish war. And of course, the landscape of Europe is going to change. You are going to see a 5-mile wide minimum dead zone that will stretch for 475 miles from Switzerland all the way to the English Channel. Because people cannot stand up to the defensive firepower that they are capable of generating. Wearing a shirt is not going to be successful against this type of firepower. Inability to control artillery is not going to be successful. War has come to a complete stalemate. So if we look at the casualties that are achieved at this number, they are staggering. So from August to December, the French have taken 600,000 casualties. The British, 90,000, again, of an army of only 160,000 deployed. Half of the Belgians have become casualties, and the Germans have perhaps suffered 700,000 casualties on the Western Front alone. War has really gotten very, very bad. And these casualties per month for such a short time are the highest of the entire World War I. So fighting out in the open is just not something that you can really do any longer. So with that said, we will take next week and we will talk about how to break the trench stalemate. So does anybody have any questions quickly? Yes?
Was it, in your view, a failure of intelligence or imagination, or why was the nature of the war not more accurately foreseen by the generals on either side?
All right, so did everybody hear that? Why was the nature of the war not accurately foreseen by the generals on both sides? It's a good question. I think particularly the British, should have known better with the effects of the Boer War. Certainly, they both had sent advisors to see the Japanese-Russian War of 1905, and saw that had ended up in a trench stalemate. I just think that they believe that, particularly the French, that their troops were just better, that their troops somehow would be able to deal with this, that their elan would carry them through. But the answer really isn't a good one. They really probably should have known better, that indeed it's almost impossible without different technologies to win in these. Defense is just too strong. It's just much too strong to attack out in the open with the capabilities that the defense had at this point. So it's a great question. I don't have a solid answer. Anyone else? All right, well, thanks for coming.